Now joining Jemele on stage, Ibtihaj Muhammad.
Here we are.
Hello.
There we go.
I thought that Jemele and I were going to twin today.
I know,
That's
my
why I
bad.
wore this jersey. I thought you were going to wear it too. Next time.
Next time, right? You got to send me the memo to make sure I get it. So a lot of people here may not be quite familiar with your background. Olympian fencer, obviously, Olympic fencer rather. Why don't you explain to the audience how you even got into fencing?
So I started fencing at 12 years old. My mom and I were driving past the local high school, and when I was growing up and playing these different sports, we always had to alter the uniform as a kid who was Muslim and didn't wear, tank tops or team shorts. I would wear, spandex or a T-shirt underneath the tank top. But I remember we were driving past the local high school, and we saw fencers. My mom was like, I don't know what that is, but I want you to try it out. And that was why I got into fencing and how I got started, yeah.
So, fencing, I think most people, is perception and reality that it's kind of an elitist sport. So, as a Muslim woman of color, how did you navigate that elitism that seems to be a part of fencing?
It hasn't always been easy. I don't know if it's ever been easy. I saw from the first time as a kid when I would travel with my team that was very supportive of me being a black athlete, a black fencer. When I would travel with my team to different townships within New Jersey for kids who maybe had never seen someone black on the fencing strip, that's when I noticed the difficulty, even with referees and other parents and things like that. So I was aware of it from a pretty young age. And I think the frustration lies in that you see very little change the older you get, the further you get in the sport. And that's why I choose to, speak out against, the things that I see in my sport.
But also as a Muslim woman, there were definitely some nuances to how you want and need to live your life that are not necessarily conducive in the sport that you chose. Like you told a story before about Ramadan. You were fasting during Ramadan and your coach's reaction to that. Why don't you tell everyone that story?
I'm sure most of us at this point know what Ramadan is, but for those of you who don't, Muslims observe a fast. 29 or 30 days we fast from sunup to sundown, and we abstain from food, any liquids, water, anything. And I am often training for the last few years during Ramadan. World Championships always falls during Ramadan, and at training camps, the national coach would, call me he's like, so stupid. Like, what are you doing? Like, you're going to kill yourself. And he, imagine in that kind of public space to be antagonized and made to feel, different, but also made to feel inadequate as an athlete, right? Like, he didn't see the connection and how important my faith is to me. And for me, I always put my faith over my sport, but I know that abstaining from food and water, it's of the mind, right? I know that I know where my meal is going to come. I know when the sun goes down, I can eat again. And I realize that not everybody has that opportunity. There are people who fast who don't know when they're going to, be able to break their fast because they may not have access to clean drinking water or food. And for me, having to participate in a sport at the elite level, not always easy, but it's definitely harder when the people around you make it more difficult.
Have you found, or did you find just in general, that your experiences as a Muslim athlete, that was a shared experience with other Muslim athletes? Like, were you all basically kind of experiencing a lot of the same things?
I don't know of any other professional Muslim athletes, not while I was competing. I know of a few who participate in the NFL and a few that maybe we've heard of that I don't know, Habib, I don't know how to pronounce his last name, the Russian MMA fighter.
Oh, yes.
Yeah, there's a few.
Right.
But I know for me, in growing up, a lot of the references that I had of Muslim athletes were always, some of the GOATs, like Muhammad Ali or Kareem Abdul-Jabbar, Hakeem Olajuwon. So when I know that they fasted and they observed Ramadan and played in the playoffs or had these really big matches. So for me, it always seemed relatively easy. So it's like, if these people can win championships, then I certainly can, make it through the first few rounds of a world championships.
You had a very, I wouldn't call it startling, but it just was one of those comments that you made that made me go, wow, I never thought of it that way. In an interview with ESPN last summer, you said that the Muslim experience post 9/11 and the Muslim experience now are eerily similar, if not harder in this moment. What made you say that?
Well, when, during 9/11, I was a kid. I remember I was in high school. I was in AP English, and like the rest of us, I kind of watched the towers fall from like a television in our classroom. And I grew up 30 minutes outside of New York City. A lot of the kids in my township had parents who worked in New York City, and I had a relative who worked in New York, so it hit very close to home for us. But I grew up in a very inclusive environment. I grew up in a diverse town. I didn't feel what maybe other Muslims would feel in that moment of isolation or this kind of advanced bigotry that was, kind of taking us by storm in our nation or even globally. But I would say now, especially when I qualified for the Olympics, it was the height of the presidential election. We have, it's become commonplace to think of the Muslim community in a way that's often dark and negative. And I've always felt like my journey in sport and qualifying for an Olympic team during this time, it's always meant to happen that way because it forces people to rethink this narrative that we're also used to. Like, people turn on the television and think it's okay to watch programs that depict Muslims as terrorists, right? To think that all Muslim women, are Arab or are oppressed or uneducated or are forced to cover by some man. And it's like, I'm American by birth. I'm African American. I only speak English. I'm educated. I'm super verbal. I'm going to tell you exactly how I feel. And I won an Olympic medal for my country. So I'm everything that you think that I'm not. And so I feel like this is an opportunity for me to tell my story. It's one of my American identity, my African American identity, my Muslim identity, my female identity, my Jersey identity. It's like all these things, and I have the opportunity to tell that story. And it's not just for me, but it's for everybody who's ever been made to feel as if they don't belong. It's frustrating, and I'm sure you feel the same when you walk in a room and there's all these different stereotypes that precede you. And I know that for me, I've struggled with that, especially as an athlete, because you want to essentially just want to play, right? You just want to go out there and you want to win. You don't want people to try to label you before you even, start the game.
A reminder, you guys can go to Slido.com if you have any questions for Ibti, and we already have one. How much attention did you get for wearing a hijab, and did you expect all of the attention, and did you enjoy it?
Spotlight isn't really my thing, but I think it's important for us to acknowledge first, it's problematic when, a sport like fencing is, just reserved for one group of people who have a certain amount of money. It's frustrating. I know that for me, without the support of a nonprofit, I wouldn't have had the career that I had in sport. So when I hear from people like, oh, you get attention because you wear hijab, no, I get attention because I won an Olympic medal. Like, let's be very clear. But I do think that it's important to celebrate first. Like, why not? There's one thing that people never talk about is that I'm also the first woman of color to represent the United States women's saber team. That becomes lost because people just identify me as wearing hijab, but it's like, no, I'm also the first woman of color. So there's a lot of barrier breaking within the sport of fencing, and it's not for me. Like, I actually don't want people to celebrate me. I want people to celebrate the fact that we have, this moment of inclusion and diversity within the sport, but also hopefully it opens our eyes, especially for our youth, to see themselves in this space. It's hard to never see representation and to visualize that happening for you. And for me, I know it would have been easier had I had someone who looked like me in this space. And I know it's easier for the young kids of color coming up now because they can unconsciously graft their aspirations. They know that it's possible. And for some of us, that wasn't the case.
Here's the next question. What was the most challenging thing you had to overcome, and how did you do it?
Most challenging thing I would say is just to block out all the noise. It can be really easy to get caught up in things that you can't control, right? We all have people in our lives who sometimes come dressed as friends, who pretend to support us but are really just like haters, right? They're not there to hype you up. They're there to low-key break you down, to not support your abilities and your strengths and not to help you identify that you actually are gifted and you're great and you can accomplish whatever it is you put your mind to. And so many of us wait around for people in our lives to give us permission to chase down what we want. And I feel like with me, I'm really fortunate in that I arrived at this notion early on that I don't need other people. You know what I mean? For a long time, I was waiting for people to support me, but I was that kid who had my hand up first in the class, who wanted I wanted an A all the time. I wanted to be good in the classroom. I wanted to be good, on the field. And that's not always, the most popular thing to do. I was bullied as a kid, relentlessly, and it was tough, but I think that having those moments is what shaped me into, who I am today. I really don't care what people think. I'm no, I'm out here to chase down what I want, whether you like it or not, right? I don't need permission from other people, and I feel like we all need that for ourselves, right? So many of us say, I'm too old to chase down what I want, or I'm not smart enough, I'm not bright enough to chase down what I want. And I always say, why do you need other people to tell you what you can do, right? Why do you need other people to give you that permission? You have to learn to give that permission to yourself.
Well, what's the old phrase? Everybody in your circle is not in your corner, right?
100%.
Yeah. Here's another good question. Have there been repercussions for speaking out against ignorance that you faced, and has it been worth it?
Repercussions, I don't know. I kind of phased out of sport a bit. When I only fenced for a year after the Olympic Games. I did one more year. And then I took a break to write my book and kind of never went back. So even if I had people who weren't happy with the book, nobody ever approached me about it. Maybe I don't know, maybe they're afraid of me. I'm not really sure. But nobody ever said anything to me about it. I think that when you're telling the truth, what can you say, right? My book, Proud, I document how difficult the journey was as a Muslim, as a black woman coming up through a very white sport, and a sport that it's very much so intentional to keep it that way. And so to document that and tell that story makes people uncomfortable, but what are you gonna do if it's true? All I'm doing is shining a light on something that I feel like is a problem, and hopefully it'll change. I think when you acknowledge something, you're forcing people to realize the mistakes that they make, and hopefully going forward they change.
Before we get to this next one, I think you recently said that you wouldn't compete in Tokyo in 2020. What went into that decision?
Hardest decision I've ever made in my life. You can ask, and I talk to so many of my friends who have played professional sport and have been on Olympic teams, and I'm how do you arrive at this decision where you decide to retire from sport? And nobody has a definitive answer, but you just pray that you're making the right decision. And I don't know if I'll ever be 100% on it, but I just feel like my impact in sport is so much greater than fencing, right? I think that fencing was a vehicle for me, and really it's about impacting the world in a way that's positive, and hopefully always being an agent of change. And I think that fencing was just, has always just been a vehicle for me, and it doesn't have to be on the strip. I know that I can do so off the fencing strip as well.
Another important question here: how can young people in Southeast DC get involved in fencing? And I would just say just in general, because people may not be aware of how they can get involved in the sport.
Oh, Google, right? That's what I would do.
Google.
I'm not from here, but I would Google it, right? Yeah.
General,
this is forever ago, but when I was a kid and we saw the sport, my parents didn't know what it was, but we went on to Google. That's how it might have been AOL at the time, but that's how we found it.
Wait, did you have the dial-up? Was it
I hope not.
Oh,
Am I
so
that
you're not
old?
that old.
I don't know.
She's dial-up, what's that?
It probably was, right? No, I had AIM, so I'm that old. But Yeah, I mean, I would say just Google it, right? There's so many different fencing hotspots around the country. DC is one of them. New York, San Fran, Texas. There's so many different places you can find a sport.
I hope I'm pronouncing this correctly, but what made you choose saber versus epee or foil?
Almost. You were almost there.
Is it epee?
Saber, epee, foil. So
Saber, epee,
there's 3 different weapons in fencing. The difference is the target area and the weapon itself.
Okay.
In foil and epee, you hit with the point. Foil, the target area is the torso. Epee is the full body, so you can hit the head, the toes. Saber, waist up, and you use slashing motions to score. So we're more like, we're like Zorro, right? So I'm your bodyguard. I'm your bodyguard, Jemele.
Nice.
We're also the sprinters of the sport. So this is the fastest weapon. I fence saber, and I started in epee, and my high school team needed a saber fencer, so that's why I switched.
Shout out to the fencing person who asked that, because I
Right?
know, whoever you are in this room, thank you for
But
asking.
now everybody is a professional fencer. Now you all know, right?
So before we wrap it up, there are a lot of athletes, a lot of young people who want to get involved and want to share their story, who kind of want to do what you've been able to do, is turn your story into a testimony. What advice do you have to people who wish to kind of do what you did? They may not have led the same life, but they kind of want to turn their story into something beyond just a story.
Well, I mean, I always say that your following, like your audience, is what you make it. You don't have to have, millions of followers behind you to reach people, right? You can have a few hundred, you can have a few, like 1 or 2, and you can reach people in any way. And it's all about trying to, I believe, impact people in a positive way and always trying to be an agent of change. It's really important to me that I use sport in a way that changes people's lives, and I've been able to do so and just finding my footing in activism. I feel really strongly about athletes using their platforms for good, and I would encourage everyone out there to do the same. You don't have to be a professional athlete to use your voice. I will not say it as eloquently as Marty did, but I feel like we all have a responsibility to speak up, especially in this moment, because things are very difficult. Even if it's not for you, it's for your neighbor, it's for your friend, it's for even people who don't look like you and share the same experiences. So I think it's important for all of us to find our footing in activism, for sure. And
as always, do what you can where you are. Everybody can't be number 7, you know what I'm saying? Or everybody can't be Ibtihaj Muhammad, but whatever it is your way of expressing something you're passionate about, do that. It could be just bringing meals to senior citizens. It could be a number of little small things you can do to change somebody's life. So I think that concludes the talking portion of this panel. A big round of applause for Ibtihaj. And thank you all just in general for your attention, for your questions, and for staying engaged. So thank you.